All right, we're recording. This is January 27 already, and the Service APIs meeting. Have a few things happen the past week that would be good to talk about. I don't see Bowie here yet, so I'm going to hold off on his items for a little bit. I'm assuming he'll show up. And so we'll move on to the timeline for a V0.2 release. Someone had requested, I think this is someone from the Knative community had requested that we get a release out, or at least provide some guidance on when another release would be incoming. I know we'd made some validation updates and improvements specifically for them. And yeah, I think we've definitely intended to have a V0.2 release. We just haven't quite made it to that point yet, and none of us have had a real incentive to get a release out. But I think now that we actually have someone asking for it, it would be good to prioritize it. I know we'd originally discussed sometime in January even releasing 0.2. That's not going to happen, but I would be open to a 0.2 at some point in the next few weeks. I took a look at the changes since 1.0, our first final V1 Alpha 1 release. And there's some fixes for default values, for validation, and for conditions, status, essentially. That's all that I can kind of summarize in here. I don't know if I'm missing anything. So I don't think an 0.2 release is going to be a huge set of changes, but I think it is still valuable to get those various fixes tied to a specific release version. Does anyone have any guidance or thoughts around a 0.2 release timeline here? All right, well, I think I'm leaning towards sometime early in February. For anyone who's also working on the Kubernetes release cycle, I think it's February 9, there's an enhancements freeze, so I'd rather stay away from that because I know a lot of people are also working on the enhancements for this cycle. But I would say either slightly before or slightly after that, the first half of February at least, it would be good to get a 0.2 release out. Any hesitation about that timeline? All right, I'm gonna run with it. Cool. The other one that I wanted to cover real quick is a follow-up on the webhook PR. I see that Harry is here, and I think you and I had slightly different understandings on, and I trust yours more, I should say, on what we intended for filters here, and specifically if we intended to allow multiple filters of the same type to exist in the same route rule. Harry, maybe explain how you envision multiple filters of the same type being used.
Yes, so can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So we have filters of primarily two types, right? One are entry filters and one are external, right? And then in the entry filters, we have two conformance levels, right? We have one core and one extended. So the behavior of core and conformance filters is defined, uh, is concretely defined. So we have stayed away from introducing like multiple filters of the same kind should not be allowed. So that's so. For example, if we have uh, it's a request header injector, or I forget the name of the filter. Uh, but if we
Modifier.
request modifier or filter.
Header modifier. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, header modifier. So we allow we are asking users to use that filter only once whenever there is a on a specific rule of the route, right? So
Yeah.
you use that one once. My point here is more about, like, okay, we can specify that behavior, but for custom filters, which is sort of a huge extension point, we should allow for multiple custom filters. The reason for that is, let's say any implementer decides to implement uh, custom filters using a set of CRDs, or maybe a generic CRD. Now that user should be able to specify that filter multiple times, right? um, so that's like, because we don't know how the end, how custom filters will behave, right? We are not defining that behavior. So that's why I think it's best to stay away from limiting the number of instances of custom filters, because that is anyways implementation specific.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think that specific example of using a generic extended CRD reference kind of thing that represents a generic filter, right? And you could describe a bunch of different filters for a single implementation there. Uh, I can see how you might want to reuse that. Um, so I think what you're suggesting here, if I'm understanding correctly, is that we should scope this webhook validation to only validate core filters that we're aware of and that we know we don't want more than one of.
Correct.
Okay. And so that doesn't even, so it doesn't even necessarily mean that, or prevent us from adding another filter in the future that's core that could be repeated. We just know the two core filters we have right now should not be repeated.
Correct. So
Okay.
essentially starting like super restricted and super small, and then opening it up in future. So
Okay. Yeah, I think that seems reasonable. Yeah, that's a compelling enough use case that I don't think we want to prevent it. Uh, any other thoughts on this front? All right, I'll follow up with this after. I'll leave this tab open. I'll follow up after to just describe what we said here. But I think that makes sense. Um, let me get into this gateway service APIs renaming. I don't know. But we started this conversation, it looks like a couple days ago. Uh, should we change the name of this repo to align with the primary resource name? So Bowie mentioned it below, but apparently when this repo was created, the idea was this is a set of APIs that are going to iterate on Kubernetes services, expand, et cetera, right? And so it made sense. Now that we have a concrete resource name that we've voted on and seem to have some kind of consensus around, service APIs almost seems wrong because this is an API that has no resource in it called service itself, right? So this somehow feels like maybe we should consider renaming the project to reflect the resources that are within it. Anytime we rename a project, it is a lot of work, and we should not do it lightly because it's also a lot of, requires community to adjust and understand, oh, this project that I knew was this is now this. So I tried to ping some other maintainers on this as well. I don't know that, it looks like Danian also has just responded. Let's just have an open discussion here. maybe Bowie, do you want to provide a little bit more background too on the idea behind a potential name change?
Oh, this was just some feedback that people got a bit confused because while the project is named Service APIs, most people ended up calling the thing Gateway. And it became, for some people were saying it's a discoverability problem that they couldn't find it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's a compelling reason that as people start to use this API more, the traditional search would just be, oh, Google Kubernetes gateway or search for a Kubernetes gateway, right? And if this is called service APIs, that could be confusing potentially. I don't know, Daniel. Do you have any more to add? I think you have an interesting comment here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to your earlier point is, it's a pain in the butt to do a name change. And so I think we need to have real solid evidence to cause the name change. So you gave the example of like discoverability. So I just went and said, okay, let me go to Google and do a search for Kubernetes gateway class. And I mean, it's all service API stuff.
Yeah.
The API spec, Kubernetes service. I mean, let me try gateway too. And yeah, so when we go to, when we do a Kubernetes gateway search, that's where we get into what we would expect since gateway was taken by, what is it, by Istio, a lot of Istio that shows up. And then Kubernetes ingress.
Interesting. Okay.
Which, I think, I don't know what others think, but I would think that this first doc that popped up, which is, the official ingress documentation on the official Kubernetes doc site, I would think that we'd probably want something in here anyways that references service APIs, right?
Yeah, definitely. We will certainly need to add documentation referencing our service API documentation for this project without committing to a name. Yes, I completely agree. Yeah.
I'll mention a couple things. So I personally think that it is about the marketability of the project. Service APIs is such a generic term. I mean, if you search service APIs, so many things are use some combination of those terms. That it's hard to be concrete about what that really references, because it's so generic. And also the plural aspect, it seems like different people calling it service APIs, the service API, service dash API. It doesn't feel as concrete as a marketable name for the project as something like Gateway, which is a bit more of a concrete name. And so I think that's kind of like my perspective on it, which I think is important for the project because it is something that requires consensus and awareness about the project for it to succeed as a standard. So that's why, those things I feel are a little relevant, at least at this early stage of the project where it probably doesn't have as much awareness as it will in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I would add that the pluralization is something like we have certainly already struggled with when we're writing about service APIs, and because there's already a service resource in Kubernetes upstream, we can't just say service API. That would not work. So we can't simply describe this project as service API or the service API. So I think that connection to the service resource adds some confusion here. That like Mark said, we are really early on in this project, at least as far as broader awareness goes. And if we're going to make a change now, it will primarily affect us and basically the group that is building either the project or building on the project, but not necessarily people that are actually using the project yet, because I don't think that's a large group. So if we are ever going to change this name, this is a good opportunity, or at least bad opportunity. But I will certainly say this would be a lot of work, and I agree with Danian. We should not do it lightly.
Oh, so Bowie, when you initially named it Service APIs, it was with a vision. It seems from a comment that it was about iteration of Kubernetes services, and we have discussed that in passing. That in future maybe gateways, like our gateway API or service APIs, whatever you call it now, can be used to do that, right? So are we narrowing down the scope of the project to be an iteration of ingress, which is what it is today, and then not be concerned about iteration of services in future?
I don't think there's a narrowing of the scope per se. Yeah, we can view this in two ways. One is that, are we trying to like redefine the charter? The other one is like, is this mechanically just changing the repo name so it's easier to find?
I see. So the charter still remains the same, that someday maybe we can, like, this project can contribute to breaking up services in future.
Yeah, I think so. I think that we already have with the sort of like the backend config and talking about L4. I don't think that aspect of it we're seeing it changing. I think this is mostly like if I type this into like a web search, what's going to help us find the project, and also from a project naming perspective, because we have two distinct names right now, and the desire would just be to have one.
I see.
Like I do see a point that if there were to be, I mean, basically the way we're going about this is, okay, gateway is the top of the tree, of this resource tree, and so that should be the name, right? And so I do see a concern if there were ever another top level resource type that existed, that this that HTTP routes and other routes would use, then I would see a problem. But I think that gateway is being used at least even the gateway resource is being thought of as a pretty generic thing that doesn't necessarily just limit the scope to ingress. And if it was just scope to only ingress, then I would say that there is definitely room for other top level resources. And then because of that, maybe gateway isn't the best name for the project. So I guess it depends about our thoughts on the flexibility of the gateway resource and whether that will, remain as the top level resource on the tree.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think I kind of alluded to this here, that we seem as a community to be pretty happy with the gateway name, and it's hard for me to imagine another top level resource. I know, never say never, but gateway does seem like it is the fundamental component of this API. If we were uncertain, we could try and use some variation of routing and whatever, but again, that would also potentially be difficult to find. So if we're trying to increase discoverability, I think the gateway name is likely both the easiest to find and also the most marketable or easiest to reference in docs and whatever else it might be.
I think like, though, to be fair, like if we all just decided to call this project Gateway API and then just left the URL service APIs, it's not like how much does changing the URL sort of make that true versus just everyone calls it? We decide to kind of change all of our docs to call it Gateway API.
I think
That would be very
Maybe this is
similar.
like advocating a bigger change than just the repo name. Like we hunt down every last reference to service APIs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It certainly, I think the primary desire here is to focus on discoverability and marketability, I suppose, of this project, and that does not necessarily require changing the actual URL involved here, the actual GitHub project name. I feel like if we change the project name without changing the repo name, we would regret it at some point in the future, but I recognize that the vast majority of work here is changing the repo name, not the project name.
I think if we do decide to rename, we should go all in and have a note that this project was previously named Service APIs. Because if we are not consistent, I think it will cause a significant amount of more confusion with newer users. And that's support overhead that I think we should avoid right now. Like we have to pay that cost now, or we'll have to pay that, confusion, like clearing out the confusion cost later.
Yeah, I agree with Harry. If we're going to make the change, let's just completely do it and make that transition.
Yeah, there will never be fewer projects referencing or importing service APIs than there are now. So
Here just made me think of something. This actually kind of came from some of the users. We were having internal testers test out the GKE gateway controller for our cloud load balancers. And in using it, they started referring to it as gateway because that was the kind of fundamental, building block resource they used. So that commonly when they actually use the API, no one is thinking of the term service APIs, and they're kind of referring it to as the gateway. And that's just kind of something I've noticed. So I do feel like when you end up using it, you don't really, service APIs doesn't really appear in any place of the usage, except, obviously you refer to a service. I don't know, that was just an observation and one data point.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I'm not against renaming. I'm just more concerned with the mechanics of it, right? Like, so that logic completely adds up, and even in passing, people have mentioned it as gateway API. So yeah, I'm just, my point is, if we rename, let's just do it completely.
Okay, I think let's follow up on the thread. It sounds like most people are in favor of doing the rename, and the time to rename is now. I think like, for example, Java used to be called Oak, and if they like named themselves Oak, they would have saved like 20% of the size of every Java executable. But anyways, like that's a anecdote about naming and when to do it.
yeah, no, that makes sense. It seems like this would be good to also get some feedback from the broader SIG network community as well. And maybe if we were to move forward with a rename on this, we could try to have it in place in time for our 0.2.0 release so that it is easy to target. If we were to do this, a gateway API release at 0.2.0. So as people are updating imports. Again, if we did this, it would be fairly straightforward. Okay, well, let's leave this thread going for maybe a week or so. I think there's at least a reasonable amount of support, but I don't know that we've completely reached everyone on board at this point. So maybe we can discuss any more bits of hesitancy we might have here, and continue in this thread, and revisit next week, both in this meeting and in the SIG Network community meeting, and make a final decision then.
Would it make sense, Bowie, to maybe send out a message on SIG Network mailer and get some feedback just to make sure that there's no one against it? Or I guess to Rob's point, the other option would be just discussing it over a SIG Network call.
I think both make sense. Yeah, might as well send something out on mailer as well, just to get the broadest audience possible. Never want any kind of rename to come as a surprise. All right, cool. Yeah, and feel free to follow up here on mailing list, or yeah, next week as well. All right, Bo, you also added one, and as soon as I saw this on the agenda, I was like, oh man, because I went ahead, I think end of last year, and I got links to kind of things to track implementations of a variety, like everyone I know is currently working on an implementation of service APIs. And I think I have reasonably good links for everyone at this point. But if I haven't talked to you, like right now, I know of Trafic, I know of Kong, I know of Contour, Istio, I know of course, GCP ourselves. Are there any other potential implementations or works in progress that would be good to add to some kind of implementations page?
We're in the works with Contour, but we're not there yet. I think we're still another, probably 30, 60 days out.
Yeah, no, that's completely fine. I think even if we can just link to, I think you had an issue kind of tracking your progress towards an implementation. I know that's all we'll be able to provide for GCP, at least up front. And then that can gradually change to a link to an actual implementation that you can use. I think implementations that are currently usable are limited to Istio and Trafic, but happy to be wrong there if there's any others out there.
Yeah, especially Contour, you guys have public issue tracking that should suffice for now. We just make it clear what the status is.
Yeah, I have some PRs up already for some support, so it's
Cool.
It's not 0, but it's not 100 yet. So more than 0, less than perfect. So yeah.
That makes sense. I think that's where a lot of us are right now. Cool. All right. I will follow up. I'll probably get a PR out soon that includes either links to tracking issues or links to demos for the ones that actually have something in progress. Well, that can be used right now. And we can go from there. But yeah, I completely agree. We should have an implementations page up. I lost track of this one. I'll just add a note that I'll follow up. This one. All right. I think I've made it through. We've made it through the first few here. I did want to add a little bit of time. Oh, that's handy. Oh, whatever. I did want to spend a little bit of time discussing this gateway route binding thing again. We actually did end up merging this PR from Mark. Thank you for, Mark has made some incredible improvements to our documentation, so thank you. But we ended up merging this after some consensus in the comments about how we should describe the relationship between a gateway and routes and what pattern we should recommend here. And I think what you've described here is completely reasonable here, Mark. It makes sense. It's basically describing a type of gateway. So in this case, a prod web gateway is the route selector that's being used, the label that's being used, and then you would add that label on the route itself. That is one of many patterns that are possible, obviously. But as we were digging through this conversation and trying to understand exactly how this relationship works, it got me wondering kind of more broadly if there are still flaws in our route selection and if we need to revisit any part of this. And to be clear, this is very early in my thought process and I don't have a solution. I just wanted to get other people thinking about it and see if anyone else had been thinking about the same flaws I had and had already thought of solutions or ways to tackle this. But one of the most fundamental things that I think is challenging here is that and we have discussed this, but a route owner is fundamentally in control of what gateway it is bound to. And we try to make the relationship look the other way, but the route owner is the one that controls the labels on the route. So if it has any concept of what a gateway is selecting, it can decide what gateway it wants to use. And go ahead, Mark.
After thinking about this quite a bit, I do feel like that maybe users go into two camps, and I'm really interested to hear what other people think. That like either the route, basically the platform administrator presents a couple of options to service owners and say, hey, here's what you can use. And route owners make the decision. They're the ones that make the decision which gateways they're bound to. Or it's the other way around where the platform administrator wants them to have no awareness of how it's exposed and they perform the mappings of routes to gateways. I kind of feel like users fall into one of those two camps. So basically there's really just like two primary relationships or ways that they can be bound. Does anyone else see it similarly or have like more detailed examples?
I thought this came up in the design. It's a handshake, so it supports both use cases.
It does theoretically support both, but the gateway owner has pretty limited control. It's somewhat a handshake, but only so much a handshake as, the route can basically change almost all of the variables. The only thing the gateway can really restrict is what namespaces it selects routes from. But that's the extent of its control. If you assume that a route owner itself can choose whatever labels it wants.
But like the route owner could just delete the route. I don't.
Right, sure. Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is the route owner has 95% of the control in this relationship.
I don't understand quite what that means per se. Because if they don't expose it, nothing happens. So it's not clear what they control.
Well, so one example is like if the service owner needs to control low level, I don't know, path, like which path things are routed to and stuff like that. But basically the platform administrator needs to determine how that route's actually exposed on which listener and things like that. And there's no way to, I mean, it's kind of difficult to separate those two. if you're doing it by label based, because the route owner can change the label and influence which gateway they're exposed on. There's no way to concretely and totally separate those two, unless you basically say, okay, it's basically like a map a gateway per namespace, which is a totally suitable way. But I don't know. That's where I want to get feedback.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to contrast this to, you know, originally one of the proposals we had, and to be clear, I'm not suggesting we go back to this, but one of the original proposals we had was a list of route references inside Gateway. And what that did give you, which we don't have right now, is a way for the Gateway admin to in a very fine-grained way to say, these are the routes I'm going to select and nothing else. And the route owner
Yeah, but
basically had no control over that.
Didn't we talk through that? Like, people can just edit just because you stabilize the name doesn't mean that the contents is stable. So it's kind of
that's fair.
Sort of meaningless.
That's fair. Then at that point you can change, the route owner can change the service the route is referencing. So I guess the real answer is that there's a limited amount of protection anything can give you at this point. You basically have to trust a namespace.
But right, I just like, what kind of protection could you have? Because if you just wanted that level of protection, wouldn't you just copy the contents of it somewhere else and then not let the user touch it at all?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
Like if you wanted control, then basically you wouldn't give the user this level of control. You would just control it yourself.
Yeah, I guess the path I was going down is our selection model kind of more confusing than it needs to be if the route owner is ultimately what has control, and should the route just choose the gateway or gateways it wants to be connected to?
No, we discussed this at length. Like there are use
Okay.
cases in both ways, right? For example, you create a route and it's not like someone else in a different namespace has a gateway and suddenly is able to select that even though you didn't want it to be exposed. And then the other way was that, like I have a bunch of gateways and I just want to automatically enroll namespaces.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just the naming that's confusing, because I've always thought of like the route binding as more of a filter than selection, right? And so if we think of it as a filter, it's like a way for the gateway to filter all these different routes that may be out there. And our default filter says, hey, we're going to filter out all routes except the routes that are in, my namespace as a gateway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe, I don't know if it helps with this use case, but maybe we need to think about the naming and consider this actually being a filter as opposed to a selector. I guess the only concern there is, I think we use filter kind of at the route level to mean something different.
Yeah, I think
a selector is a filter. It's
okay.
Well, I'm just saying, like, I don't, because they're basically predicates. It's like, does it belong to this set of things? And that's basically what it does.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is here, but I think this is one of the most confusing parts of our API still. And although it's powerful, I just want to make sure we've thought through any potential way we could simplify or make this easier for users to understand. It sounds like some of the first little bits of feedback we've gotten is, around the gateway route relationship, which is kind of a key part to this API, and that it can be confusing.
I think we need to give an illustration of both use cases in both directions. This is like, we did discuss this quite a bit, and there are use cases in both directions. So I don't think as part of simplification, it makes sense, unless we get like heavy feedback that one of the use cases is not valid, that we just eliminate one of the use cases as part of simplification. Just because we went through this discussion quite at length.
Right, and I know, I mean, we selected, or we consolidated on selectors because that's the Kubernetes way of making that that association, right? I mean, we originally were talking about, you know, a list of routes. Maybe we could use a list of namespaces where all routes in those namespaces, but again, that's seems like that's not the way that Kubernetes does things. So
I think this goes back to what you said earlier, Daniel, where it is actually more about kind of the example that we're using in the label selector. Whereas, you know, do route owners think of this as like they are putting in attributes of the gateway to determine where it gets exposed, or are they putting in attributes of their app in that label? Like, do they put their app name in that label or some attribute of their app? It's like, is that label kind of like a downward reference or an upward reference to something? And I don't know. I'm like, I was kind of confused when writing this, whether it should be like a characteristic of an app or it should be selecting the gateway. Maybe both are valid.
yeah, so that's a good point, is maybe that's what we need to kind of settle on, is what's kind of the naming guidance for these labels. As you mentioned, Mark, is it more of an upward or downward reference? And I need to look at the API to see, Rob, if you're there, what are, I guess we just say it's just a selector, right? Do we get into what match labels, or probably just...
No, we don't. This doc is the closest we've come to providing a recommendation here. And it is entirely, there was some discussion in the comments about different ways we could do this, whether we wanted to describe characteristics of an app or an environment or a whatever. In this case, the solution that Mark suggested here, I think is a good balance, but it is one of several ways to do this. And it's basically you select based on an infrastructure family or specific gateway name, depending on your perspective of what this means. So
this is really just about convention. And I think convention here is important because it is one of the most confusing and fundamental parts of the API. It's kind of like, you know, most services use app as a key for selection of pods. And so this is a similar decision here, is just kind of what keys we end up using. Customers are, you know, our users are, feel free to choose their own, but the more that we kind of converge on a convention, I think the easier this API will be to understand.
It does seem like it's more centered on the contract between the gateway and the user, the consumer, right? Because for the most part, I would imagine lots of people wouldn't even put that selector there. They would just have like a list of namespaces to come from. And then you'd have to put a selector there only if you're offering multiple different kinds of gateways. And there you sort of, people want to distinguish which particular ones they want to be exposed on. The assumption is like, once you have given a given namespace a way to expose on that gateway, then like they're free to kind of create routes. Now, the further narrowing is mostly for the creator of routes to say, although they have other ways to do it. Yeah, it's almost like a convenience. So maybe that's not like a super common use case to actually add that selector. Definitely you need the kind, but most people probably wouldn't care for the selector so much.
Well, I think that depends. I mean, I think it's certainly possible that multiple gateways could be provisioned, or at least could select routes in the same namespace. And if that's the case, then you would want, and I recognize you can further limit that on route, but I don't know. There's just so many different ways to do things. We either need to simplify the number of ways to do things or provide very clear guidance. And I think this PR from Mark helped a lot, but I think there's still more questions or patterns we can suggest or propose here.
Yeah, it seems like since routes have the ability to choose which gateway it will be exposed on, that selector for the specific resource is less useful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, not to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I know that I've at least heard some feedback that the selector matching all routes by default is a insecure default and maybe something we should try and avoid. So if you say that maybe at some point down the road we want to require a selector to be non-empty, or at least change the empty behavior to not select anything, then the selector here has much more meaning. And yeah,
Yeah, that's like a policy thing.
Yeah.
But if you set it to empty, doesn't that just mean it's useless for that namespace?
No, I'm not talking about namespace. Yeah, that's correct. Namespace is not a selector necessarily. There's from all, from none, from same namespace kind of thing. So
Wait,
the
Rob,
selector,
this selector is on namespaces, isn't it not? It's not on the route. Are we getting confused?
Okay, so looking at the example I have here, there's a selector for routes, and then there's an option to say namespaces from all, or I think it's from selector. It might be from list. I forget which we did here. Yeah.
Oh, I
think
see.
it's
There's
from
just like,
selector.
I'm just reading the text above.
Yeah. So they're, from selector. Thank you. So there are two core options here, and basically to understand what route is being selected, you have to look at the namespace selector or from statement, the route selector, and then you have to look at the route, and you have to look at what the route is allowing itself to be selected by. So there's kind of three variables, and admittedly, you don't necessarily have to change any of them, but because there's so much going on, it can get pretty overwhelming and confusing.
One suggestion is, if we feel like this is going to be something that is targeted for removal, like we could give the basic use case and omit this as the recommendation and see how far people are able to get. Because you can still do the route chooses which gateways it gets exported on use case, as opposed to just throw it in here.
So that's exactly, Mark and I had a discussion around this. I can't remember the context. Maybe it was an issue somewhere. Regardlessly, if you use the route to be the primary mechanism for gateway selection, right now the route is tied to the route allows for a gateway reference of only allow these specific gateways to use this route. So that's a way you could accomplish that. The problem is it really prohibits seamless gateway replacement. Part of our model, as I understand it, is we want to make it less of a clear relationship between a specific gateway instance and more this
right, but I think that's like an advanced use case, is that not? I'm just talking about from the way you would explain it to users, is that you would say the gateway controls the primary basic way that you set this up is that from the gateway, you control which namespaces have access to it. And then from the route, you can pick which specific gateways you want to use. And then there is this additional like advanced use case where you're thinking of basically being able to like cut over a gateway. And then in that case, you need a level of indirection, which is this label selection. You do give something up in that. You would still have to touch the routes themselves. And the route is like a specific list, right?
Yeah, so the route you can do either let every gateway use me, let any gateway in the same namespace select me, or let this specific list of gateways select me.
Yeah, I see. So we have the namespace. I don't know, like, wouldn't you can't do the hit list cut over anyways. So on the route level, for that use case, on the route level, you would say everything within a certain namespace can select me.
That's the default.
And then, yeah, then you wouldn't need a selector either in that case.
Right. Yeah, assuming the simple
a selector
use
on
case,
the gateway.
Right, assuming that a namespace is intended to be served by a single gateway, then everything just works perfectly. But for larger namespaces, that becomes more complicated.
Yeah, I don't know, like, we shouldn't tie ourselves in knots.
Yeah.
That should be a separate use case that's like, you know, the 200 level course on gateway route selection. That seems like we shouldn't like be anchoring our prime example on that.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I'm curious.
The basic stuff should be basic. It shouldn't be like the most maximally like complicated thing that we can set up.
Yeah, that's fair. All right. Well, yeah, I think there's plenty of discussion to have here. Especially, I'm interested in feedback from others. If they start, if you see anyone who's interacting with this API in any way or just reading through it for the first time, if there's confusion around these concepts, it'd be great to understand where it is, and where our room for improvement is, because I do really want to get this gateway route relationship right. I think this is a really core principle of our API. And right now it feels like it may be more complicated than it needs to be. And maybe that's just how we're communicating it. Kind of like what you're saying, Bowie, like if we just provide the simple examples, that could help.
Yeah, I think like just leave selector out of the most basic description of this, and then we can work through the complicated use cases where that thing is relevant.
Yeah,
just, I mean, similar to, TLS struct, right? I mean, there's a lot of complication you could add there, but it's not needed for the simple use case.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. Thank you to everyone for talking through this. If you have any comments, I don't know if there's an issue tracking this, but definitely interested in more feedback on this specific relationship, and if there's room for improvement of either documentation or just the functionality itself. All right. We don't have much time, but I think there's a little bit to go through for PRs. I think I've covered at least the most recent issues. I don't know that we got time to discuss this one yet. Are we all right with basically merging custom and implementation specific into a single support
Yeah,
type?
I think the word custom is weird, so we should just choose one and then replace all instances of the word custom. I don't know where I came
feel
up with that word, but it just sounds weird.
I feel like we're using them interchangeably, and implementation specific is probably easier to understand. And that would be what I would bias towards.
I feel like there's a clear distinction, which is custom means it may or may not be implemented. Implementation specific means it's implemented, but the implementation chooses what it actually does.
Oh, that is an interesting point.
Yeah, and I'd agree with Micaiah. I mean, if we think of the names, right, core, extended, and custom, I mean, to me, it's similar to like custom resources within Kubernetes. So I lean towards custom, and implementation specific is a bit of a mouthful.
So, but to clarify, what Micaiah is saying is these are different things.
Yeah, we
Custom-
should define them actually. Then that would make it clear.
Okay, I gotcha.
And I had missed that distinction, but that is an interesting point, and we have not defined it, I think, clearly, but it may be worth clarifying between things that are implementation specific but supported broadly versus custom. Well, I don't know, right? I don't know that we ever want to require an implementation to support an implementation specific feature. Or maybe I'm misunderstanding here. Micah, I think the way you were differentiating between these two, custom and implementation specific, were both largely, custom things that would have different behavior. The difference would be that custom would not necessarily be supported by every implementation.
I think we have certain places where we actually have the word implementation specific as a type or something, like a string. Or we say like this behavior is implementation specific. And then
and
there's a other thing where it's like you can extend this somehow, and we're not going to talk about what you could possibly do in the extension.
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant. Maybe this isn't the best example, but I was thinking about path match type. And the details of regular expressions, I don't think we specified exactly what syntax you use. So the syntax for your regular expression is kind of implementation specific. That's kind of a bad example though, because I see we also have a match type that's called implementation specific, which I think maybe that should be called custom. Gets even more confusing because regular expression and implementation specific match types are both called support custom.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is confusing. I think we can come up with a clear definition and make things more consistent.
I think at the very least, the point that we have a path match type that is implementation specific, the string, we probably should not confuse that as a level of conformance as well. So yeah, this needs a little bit more thought. So this is issue 530. I know we're over time. I don't want to keep people any longer, but if we can follow up here with some additional conversation, because initially we were moving towards, I think in this conversation, just trying to merge these concepts, but it does sound like there's sufficient differentiation that we may need some more thought here. So maybe Micaiah, if you don't mind following up here, I think you had a good point about how these could be considered different. Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Okay, I'll comment on the issue.
Thanks, appreciate it. All right, well, we are past time. Thank you everyone for great feedback here, and we'll talk to you next week. Have a great one.
Thanks.
You guys.